At 44, Tomas Reyes had $312 in a coffee can, a rented trailer, and 20 years of other men's fields worked into his hands. His wife cleaned motel rooms. When the last grower in the county closed, Tomas took the only work left, day labor tearing down the condemned nursery on the road out of Rio Seco. The foreman looked at it and laughed. A row of greenhouses with every pane broken, a shade house caved in, a capped well gone dry 40 years back. The water rights had lapsed. Worthless scrub. The 11 acres had appraised at $4,000, condemned and tagged for demolition. Nobody had told Tomas what stood behind the gray shade cloth at the back of the lot, past what everyone took for more wreckage. Something the old grower had kept alive for 50 years, and a deed with Tomas's own name on it that no one had ever shown him. The morning the county trucks came, in the third week of June, the thermometer nailed to the trailer door read 101 degrees before 10 o'clock. Tomas had been awake since 4. He always was. 25 years of field work had set the hour in him and never let it go. And now that there was no field to go to, the waking only left him lying in the dark with nothing to walk toward. Elena rose beside him without a word and put the coffee on. She left for the Sunrise Motel at 5:30 in the little gray Corolla, with the 210,000 miles on it, and she would strip and remake 31 rooms before she came home smelling of bleach. Miguel was 16 and asleep down the narrow hall in a room the size of a closet. He was a junior at Rio Seco High, and he could take apart a carburetor and put it back together blindfolded. And Tomas worried about him the way a man worries about a good tool left out in the weather. There was not much work in Rio Seco for a boy who was good with his hands. There was not much work in Rio Seco for anyone. The town had been drying up for as long as Tomas had lived near it, the water table dropping a foot a year, the last of the chile fields and the alfalfa going to dust, the young people leaving on the same road the trucks came in on. Tomas had crossed north at 19 with a change of clothes and the name of a town he could not pronounce, and he had worked every kind of ground a man could work since. Onions in the bottomland, pecans in the shade of other men's trees, tomatoes under plastic in greenhouses so hot the sweat ran into his boots. He had never owned a foot of any of it. He had learned instead to read it, the way some men read faces, so that he could stand at the edge of a field in March and tell you which corner would burn out in August, and which would hold. He could put his palm flat on the ground and feel where the water still moved underneath and where it had gone forever. It was not a thing you could put on an application. When the growers filled out their papers, they wrote laborer. And Tomas had signed his name under that word. So many times he had stopped minding it. The Reyes place was not a place. It was a single-wide trailer on a rented quarter-acre at the south edge of town, with a strip of hard-packed dirt Elena kept swept, 3 tomato plants in 5-gallon buckets that Tomas babied through the heat, and a chain-link fence with a mesquite growing through it. $312 sat in a coffee can on the shelf above the stove, and that was every dollar the family had that was not already spoken for. Tomas knew the number the way he knew his own heartbeat. He had counted it the night before, the way he had counted it most nights that spring, as if counting might make it grow. So when the county called and said they needed hands to clear the old Crannle nursery before the wrecking crew came, Tomas said yes before the man finished the sentence. It paid $14 an hour, cash, 3 days of work, maybe 4. He did not tell the man on the phone what the Crannle place was to him. He was not sure he could have said it in a way an English speaker in an office would understand. He drove out in the truck he did not really own either, a 1998 Ford with the odometer, stuck at 192,000 and a driver's door that only opened from the outside. The nursery sat 2 miles past the last streetlight, where the pavement gave up and the road turned to washboard dirt. He had not been out there in 9 years. He had told himself it was because there was no reason to go. That was a lie. And he knew it was a lie the moment the place came up out of the heat shimmer, and he had to pull over on the shoulder and sit with both hands on the wheel until his chest came loose. The sign was still there. It had fallen off its posts and lay face up in the weeds, and the sun had eaten most of the paint. But you could still read it if you knew what it had said. Crannle Nursery and Glasshouse, and under that, smaller, the words that Tomas had first seen at 19 years old from the bed of another man's truck, hungry and frightened, and certain he had come to a country that had no use for him. Growers of what grows here. Behind the fallen sign stood the greenhouses. There were 5 of them, long and low, running north to south in a straight rank, and once they had been the finest glass in 3 counties. Now every pane was broken. The frames stood up out of the dirt like the ribs of something enormous that had lain down to die. And the ground, inside and around them, glittered with 50 years of shattered glass, so that when the light hit it a certain way, the whole ruin flashed like water and gave the eye a cruel promise there was nothing behind. The shade house at the far end had folded in on itself under the weight of one bad winter's snow. Tumbleweed had stacked against the north wall 2 men high. A red-tailed hawk sat on the one post still standing and watched him the way hawks watch, without any opinion at all. And there, at the very back of the lot past the last greenhouse, ran the wall of shadecloth. It was gray with age and stiff as canvas, stretched on a frame of galvanized pipe, and it had gone the color of everything else out there, the color of dust, so that a man driving past would take it for one more sheet of wreckage the wind had thrown up against the fence. Tomas had taken it for that himself, back when he still worked here. He had never once asked what was behind it. In the world he came from, a man did not ask his patron what lay behind the wall. Emmett Crannle had been the first man in the United States to write Tomas Reyes' real name on a piece of paper. That was the thing Tomas carried up the dirt track that morning, heavier than the crowbar and the water jug in his hands. 25 years back, a boy of 19 with nothing, dropped by a labor contractor at a valley of growers who each looked at him and shook their heads. Too young, no papers in order, not worth the trouble, and an old man in a straw hat, already old then, already past 60, had walked down the row of frightened men, stopped in front of Tomas, looked at his hands and said in slow, careful Spanish, "You know soil, come." He had put Tomas on the books under his own true name when it would have been cheaper and easier and safer to pay him in cash out of a coffee can and never write anything down. He had given him a cot in the bunk room behind the office and a key to the well house, and taught him to graft, standing in the shade with a paring knife, splicing a bud of one tree into the living wood of another, until the two grew as one. Then the years had turned the way years do. The nursery could not compete with the big wholesale operations trucking plants up from Mexico. Crandall let the greenhouses go one by one. Tomas moved on to the onion fields because a man with a family cannot stay out of loyalty. And loyalty had gone quiet between them the way it does between men who do not know how to say the large things. He had heard, last autumn, that the old man had died. 94 years old, alone in the county home. Tomas had not gone to the service. He had told Elena there was no service worth the gas, and that was the second lie, and he had carried it since like a stone in his boot. Now the county was going to knock it all down, and they were paying Tomas Reyes $14 an hour to help. The foreman's name was Ray Buell, and he ran the county public works crew out of a diesel pickup with the air conditioning going full blast and the windows up. He handed Tomas a pair of leather gloves and a hard hat and pointed at the greenhouses. "Anything that's not glass or steel we haul to the transfer station," he said. "Glass and steel the salvage guy takes. Wednesday the trackhoe comes and puts the rest in a hole." He looked at the ruin and shook his head the way men do at a thing they have already decided is nothing. "Whole place is a hazard. Kids come out here, cut themselves on the glass. Snakes. County should have flattened it 20 years ago." He said it in front of the other 2 men on the crew. And the other 2 men laughed, because it was the kind of thing a man laughs at when the boss says it. Tomas did not laugh. He put on the gloves. They worked through the morning, in a heat that came up off the glass in waves. Tomas cleared tumbleweed and hauled it to the trailer, and pulled the collapsed shade cloth off the caved-in frame, and carried out the ruined benches where the seedlings had once been raised. The other 2 men worked the far greenhouses and complained. And by noon they had gone to sit in the shade of the water truck, with their shirts over their heads. Tomas kept on. There was something in him that could not sit in front of the old man's ruin and rest. So it was Tomas, and only Tomas, who went into the little cinder block office at the front of the lot to clear it out, because Ray Buell said there were papers in there. And papers were the kind of thing that got a county sued if you dozed them into a hole without looking. The office was one room with a swamp cooler long dead in the window. The heat inside was worse than outside, thick and still, and it smelled of hot paper and mouse and old creosote. There was a steel desk, a swivel chair with the stuffing coming out, a filing cabinet and boxes. Boxes stacked to the ceiling, bankers' boxes and produce cartons in a footlocker, every one of them full of paper. 50 years of a man's working life, waiting to be carried to a hole in the ground. Tomas was supposed to look for hazardous material, oil, chemicals the old poisons growers used to keep. He found none of that. What he found when he opened the first box were seed catalogs. Hundreds of them, going back to the 1950s, their covers soft as cloth. The next box held weather records in a slanting hand, the rainfall for every month of every year written down in inches and tenths of inches. A whole box of a dry country counting the water that did not come. The box under that held letters. Tomas could not read all of the English, but he could read enough to know they were thank you letters, and that there were a great many of them. He worked without hurrying, and he did not tell himself why. The other men did not come to help. Ray Buell came to the door once, saw a man sorting paper, and left. It was in the third hour, in a green metal box at the bottom of the footlocker, under a folded flag and a photograph of a young soldier who must have been Crannle in another war and another century, that Tomas found the envelope. It was a large manila envelope, brittle at the corners, and someone had written across the front of it in block capitals with a heavy pencil. Tomas sounded the words out the way he sounded out all the English that mattered, slowly moving his lips. For the county if I am gone. And under that, a second line, see that the right man gets the key. Inside the envelope were documents. Tomas set them on the steel desk and smoothed them flat with the side of his gloved hand. His English was a working man's English, good enough for a foreman's orders and a clinic form and a traffic stop. And he read the top page 3 times before the words would hold still and mean what they meant. It was a legal form, printed with blanks filled in by typewriter. At the top it said quitclaim, deed. He knew that word. He had signed enough forms in enough offices to know a deed when he held one. He read the names. The grantor, the one giving, was Emmett Crannle, and the grantee, the one receiving, typed out in full with the middle name Tomas rarely saw written down because so few people up here ever asked for it, was Tomas Guadalupe Reyes. The date under the signature was more than 11 years old. Tomas sat down in the swivel chair with the stuffing coming out of it, and the heat pressed on him, and for a long moment he could not make his hands do anything at all. He read it again. He read the legal description of the land, the township and range, and the metes and bounds, the 11 acres more or less. He read the line that said this deed was recorded in the office of the county clerk, and the book and page number where it had been written into the permanent record of Pinon County. Recorded, not just signed and hidden in a footlocker. Filed. Made real in the courthouse 11 years ago under his own name, by a man who had never once said a word about it to him. Tomas did not know a great deal about American law. But he knew what recorded meant, because a recorded thing was a thing the government had written down. And in the country he came from and the country he had come to, the things the government wrote down were the things that were true whether you liked them or not. He was still sitting there when Ray Buell came to the door and said it was 1 o'clock and where the hell was he? Tomas stood up. He held the envelope against his chest. He did not know how to explain what he was holding, and he was afraid, with the old deep fear of a man who has spent his life being told that the papers are never in his favor, that if he said it out loud the wrong way it would be taken from him. So he said only that he had found some legal papers, and he thought the county clerk should see them before anything was dozed. Ray Buell put out his hand for the envelope. Tomas did not give it to him. It was the first time in 25 years he had refused a foreman anything, and his heart went hard and fast in his chest while he did it. I take it to the clerk, Tomas said, myself. And something in his face must have carried, because Ray Buell looked at him a moment, and shrugged, and said, suit yourself. It was quitting time anyway. The trackhoe wasn't coming till Wednesday. Tomas drove to the courthouse in Rio Seco with the envelope on the seat beside him and one hand on it the whole way, as if it might blow out the window that would not roll up. The county clerk was a woman named Dolores Aragon, who had worked the recorder's office for 31 years and had known everyone in 3 generations of the county by their land, before she knew them by their faces. Tomas set the deed on the counter and told her, in careful words, where he had found it and what he thought it said, and asked her to tell him if he was reading it wrong, because he was often reading English wrong and he needed to be sure. Dolores Aragon picked up the deed and read it. And then she went to the tall bound books on the shelf behind her, the ones with the marbled covers and the years stamped in gold, and she found the volume and turned to the page. And she stood there with her finger on the line for what felt to Tomas like a very long time. It's recorded, she said. Book 481, page 93. Recorded the 14th of March, 11 years ago. She looked up at him over her glasses. Mr. Reyes, this is your land. This has been your land for 11 years. Emmett Crannle deeded the whole Crannle Nursery to you, free and clear, and put it on record so nobody could ever say otherwise, and then, from the look of it, he never told a living soul. She took her glasses off. Does that sound like Emmett? Tomas did not trust his voice, so he did not use it. He nodded, because it did sound like Emmett, exactly like Emmett, a man who did the largest things in silence and then walked away before anyone could thank him. There's a problem, Dolores Aragon said gently, because she was not a cruel woman and she could see what the man in front of her was feeling. The county's got it condemned, and the water, Tomas. The water rights on that parcel show has lapsed. 20-some years ago, the state adjudicated the whole basin, and Emmett didn't file to protect the Crannle right, or the state says he didn't, and a water right you don't use and don't defend, the state calls it abandoned. The land is yours, no question. But a piece of dry desert with no water in this county is worth about what they appraised it at. $4,000, and that's for the scrap glass and the culvert pipe. She wrote out a copy of the recording for him and stamped it, and did not charge him the $2. You should talk to a lawyer, she said, and Tomas, go out there and look at your own land before Wednesday. A man ought to stand on a thing before the county puts it in a hole. He went out the next morning before dawn, alone, and this time he did not stop on the shoulder. He drove all the way up the dirt track and parked the Ford in front of the office that was now, however impossibly, his own office on his own 11 acres. And he sat and watched the sky go from black to gray to the hard white of another furnace day. Then he got out and he did what Dolores Aragon had told him to do. He stood on his own land, and because he was Tomas Reyes, and because he had spent 25 years learning to read ground the way other men read print, he noticed within the first 10 minutes the thing that not one person on the county crew had noticed in a week. There were birds behind the shadecloth wall. Not many. But in a place that had gone to dust and broken glass, in a place where the only living things were the hawk and the ants and the tumbleweed, there was a thin, steady traffic of small birds going in low over the top of the gray cloth at the back of the lot and not coming out. House finches, a pair of doves, and once unmistakable, cutting the dry air with a sound that did not belong in that country at all, the wet three-note whistle of something that only sings where there is water. Tomas walked the length of the shadecloth wall. It ran maybe 60 feet, stretched tight on its galvanized frame, and it was stiff and gray, and exactly the color of everything dead out there. And he understood in a moment how a whole crew had walked past it for a week and seen only more wreckage to be hauled away. But Tomas had strung 100 miles of shadecloth in his life, and his hands knew before his mind did that this cloth was wrong. It was not falling, it was maintained. Somebody had laced the grommets to the pipe with wire recently, in a neat over and over that had not weathered a winter yet, and where the sun had rotted the old panels, somebody had sewn new ones in behind them. A dead thing does not get sewn. He walked the wall until he found the seam, and behind the seam a frame, and in the frame a door, a plain wooden door on strap hinges, latched with a hasp and a padlock. The padlock was newer than everything around it by 50 years, and on a nail beside the door, under a little tin roof no bigger than a hand that someone had bent to keep the rain off it, hung a key. See that the right man gets the key. Tomas took the key off the nail. His hand was not steady. He fit it to the padlock, and the padlock was oiled, and it opened without a sound. He lifted the hasp and he pushed the door, and a breath of air came out to meet him that stopped him where he stood, because it was cool, and it was wet, and it smelled of green growing things and turned earth and ripe fruit. The smell of the inside of the world he had spent his whole life on the outside of. In the middle of the dying desert, behind a wall of gray cloth, everyone had called garbage. The air came out of the dark like the breath of a living animal. He stepped through, and he went down. There were steps, 6 of them, cut into the earth and lined with old brick, going down below the level of the desert floor. Tomas understood the first part of it before he even reached the bottom, understood it with the professional part of his mind that never stopped working even while the rest of him stood amazed. The old man had built down instead of up. A greenhouse in the high desert is an oven. The sun that grows the plant will also kill it. And every grower Tomas had ever worked for fought the heat with fans and swamp coolers and shade, and lost a little more of the fight every hot year. But a room dug into the ground stays the temperature of the ground, cool in the killing afternoon, warm in the freezing night. And the earth does the work for free. Crannle had sunk his real glass house 8 feet into the dirt, where no one driving past would ever see the glint of its glass, and he had roofed it in salvaged panes pitched low to the ground. And around it, and over it, he had raised the ruin of the broken houses, like a man raising a shabby coat over something worth keeping. At the bottom of the steps, Tomas stood in a long, low room full of green, and full of light coming soft and dappled through 50-year-old glass, and full, above everything else, of the sound of water. The water came from the center of the room. There, ringed in fieldstone, was the well. Not the capped steel pipe out front that the county swore had gone dry, the one with the state's tag wired to it and the concrete plug poured into its throat. That was a decoy, Tomas would understand later, a dead well left in plain sight to be tested and condemned and forgotten. This was the real one, the old one, the hand-dug one, a shaft of stacked stone going down into the dark farther than the light could follow, and beside it a cistern also of stone, also dug by hand, that the water rose into and stood in, clear and moving, a black mirror the size of a small room with the reflection of the glass roof trembling on its surface. A pipe ran from the cistern along the floor and fed a dozen little channels cut into the packed earth, and the water went out along the channels to the roots of everything growing in that room, slow and even, the oldest way there is to water a garden, and the least wasteful, the way the people of that valley had watered before the dams and the pumps, the way Tomas's own grandmother had watered 1,000 miles to the south. The county said there was no water at Crannle's, and here, coming up out of the ground on its own the way it had come up for 1,000 years, before anyone thought to argue over it, was water enough to keep a garden alive through 50 summers. The well had never run dry. Emmett Crannle had known it had never run dry, and he had let the state believe it was dead so that no one would ever come to take it. Tomas walked the length of the room with his heart going, and he looked at what the water fed. They were trees, small ones dwarfed and shaped and kept low under the glass, but trees, dozens of them, in beds and in half barrels. And Tomas the grafter saw at once that almost none of them were one tree. They were 2, 3, 4 trees grown into one. A limb of this budded onto the trunk of that, so that a single knee-high apple might carry 4 different kinds on its 4 branches, each branch labeled with a little zinc tag stamped by hand. Tomas went from tree to tree reading the tags, and the reading of them was the second time that week the ground moved under him. He knew these names, not from a catalog, from the mouths of old people. His whole life in that country, working the fields of the valley, he had heard the old ones talk about the fruit that used to grow before the water went to the cities, the way people talk about the dead. The San Ysidro apricot, that ripened gold with a red cheek and had grown in the Spanish orchards along the river until the reservoir drowned the orchards and the trees with them. The Escobosa apple, sweet and hard and made for keeping in a cellar through a winter, gone, everyone said. Gone 40 years. The Perdido pear, the Rio Seco Chile, Colorado, the little native red pod, hotter and sweeter than anything the seed companies sold, that the families of the valley had grown from their own saved seed since before there was a state, until the dry years and the cheap dried chile trucked up from the south had broken the last of the old plantings. The bolita bean, the little round tan bean of the high country that would make a pot of beans out of almost no water at all. And a melon, the striped milagro melon, whose seed Tomas had heard an old woman in an onion field weep about once, because her mother had grown it, and she had lost the seed in a move, and no one anywhere had it anymore, and a whole taste of her childhood was simply gone from the earth. It was not gone from the earth. It was here growing 8 feet under the desert, behind a wall of gray cloth, watered by a well that did not exist, kept alive by a man everyone had let die alone in the county home. Along the north wall, where the light was steadiest, ran a workbench, and along the workbench and on shelves above it and in cabinets below it stood the tins. There were hundreds of them. Coffee cans, tobacco tins, cracker tins, old ammunition boxes, jars with the lids waxed down, every one of them clean and dry, and labeled in the same block pencil capitals as the envelope in the office. Toss opened one. Inside, in little paper packets folded the way his mother had folded seed packets, were seeds. He opened another, and another. Beans in one, dull and smooth as river stones. Chili seed in another, pale gold, thousands of them. Squash melon, corn in 6 colors, the corn braided by its own husks, each packet dated. Each tin labeled with the name of the thing, and the year it was grown, and the place the mother seed had come from. Some of the dates went back further than Tomas had been alive. It was a bank. It was the whole memory of what would grow in that country. Saved and dried and folded and kept. One man's 50-year argument against the desert winning, and it was all still alive, because a seed kept dry and cool and dark is not dead. A seed is a small green fire a man banks against the winter. Emmett Crannle had banked 10,000 of them. Tomas sat down on the brick steps in the cool and the green and the sound of the water, and he put his face in his dirty hands, and he wept for the old man in the straw hat, and for the years of silence between them, and for the funeral he had been too ashamed and too poor and too proud to attend. He had thought all this time that Emmett Crannle had forgotten him, and the old man had left him the one thing on the earth he had loved most, and had trusted him, only him, out of everyone in 3 counties, to keep it breathing. He came back the next day and the day after that, in the early mornings before the heat, and he told no one, not even Elena, not yet, because the thing was too big to say, and he did not have the words for it in either of his languages. The trackhoe was coming Wednesday. He had until Wednesday to understand what he was holding and to find some way to stop the county from putting it in a hole. He worked in the cool of the glass house, and he read. On the workbench in a drawer that pulled out below the tins he found the books. Not seed catalogs this time. Ledgers, a whole row of them, cloth-bound, the kind a shopkeeper keeps. And Crannle had filled them the way a shopkeeper fills them, in columns, in ink, in a hand that started firm and grew shaky across the decades and never once stopped. Tomas took them into the light and read them slowly across 3 mornings. And what he read changed the shape of the man he had worked for and the shape of the county he had lived beside for 25 years. They were not accounts of money. There was almost no money in them at all. They were accounts of seed. Every line was a gift, a date, a name, a place, and a thing given. 2 ounces of Bolita bean seed to the Vigil family, Cañoncito, 1971. 6 grafted apricot starts to the Trujillo orchard, 1974, and beside it, years later, in the same hand, a note, bore first crop, sent word. A packet of the Rio Seco chile to a school teacher starting a garden with her class. Melon seed, corn seed, cuttings of grape and fig and quince, whole boxes of starts driven out to farms Tomas knew, in counties 2 hours off, to families whose names were the names on half the mailboxes in that country. Chimayo, Truchas, the little places up in the high country and the little places down along the dry river. 50 years of it, page after page after page, never a price, never a charge. Under the column where a merchant would have written what he was owed, Emmett Crannle had written, over and over, in the same 3 pencil strokes, the same word, given. Tomas did the arithmetic the way a poor man does arithmetic, slowly and more than once. He could not count the gifts. There were too many. But he could see, running the pages under his thumb, that in 50 years this one old man had put seed and cuttings and grafted starts into the hands of more households than lived in Rio Seco now. Across 3 drought-broken counties, in every dry year and every dead year, for nothing, and had told no one, and had let the world call his place a failed nursery, and himself a failed man while he did it. The town had thought Crannle's went broke because the old man could not compete. The old man had gone broke, Tomas understood now, because he had been giving the country away by the handful for half a century, and had counted it not as charity, which asks to be thanked, but simply as seed, which asks only to be planted. And in the last ledger, in the back, folded into the binding, Tomas found the pages that told him why. They were not columns. They were writing, close and plain, the old man setting down for whoever came after him the one thing he wanted understood. Tomas read them so many times that spring that he could have said them by heart. And later, when it mattered, he did. Emmett Crannle had been born in 1929, on a quarter section of hard red dirt on the Texas and New Mexico line, into a family of dryland farmers who kept their own seed the way their people always had, saving back the best of each crop in the fall for the planting in the spring, corn and beans and squash, and a little orchard of peach and apricot his grandfather had carried west as switches wrapped in a wet rag. He had been a boy of 6 and 7 and 8 when the sky turned to dirt. He wrote about it flatly, the way old people write about the worst thing, without any adjective at all. And it was the flatness that made Tomas have to stop and breathe. He wrote about the dusters coming black across the flat, and the cattle dead with mud in their lungs, and his mother hanging wet sheets over the windows that were brown by morning. He wrote about the orchard dying, the peach and apricot his grandfather had carried 1,000 miles. First the leaves, then the limbs, then the trees. And he wrote about the day the government man came. The government man came, in the worst of it, and paid Emmett's father to kill his own hogs and plow his own corn under, because there was too much and too little all at once, and the prices had to be saved even if the people were not. And Emmett, 7 years old, had stood at the fence and watched his father, weeping, drive the plow through the green corn, and turn the seed of 4 generations back into the dead dirt it came from. They lost the place. They went west in a truck like everyone else. And somewhere on that road, the boy Emmett Crannle had made himself a promise, the whole of which he set down at the end in one plain line that Tomas Reyes read standing up, 8 feet under the desert with the water running behind him. I made up my mind that as long as I was living, this country would never again be a place where a family had nothing left that could grow. He had spent the rest of his life keeping that promise. He had bought the worst land in Pinon County, because it was the only land he could afford, and because it had, if a man knew how to find it, one old hand-dug well the state had never mapped. He had let everyone believe the well was dry. He had grown the lost fruit of the valley back from the last living cuttings, tree by tree, and saved the seed of every good thing he could beg or trade or find, and given it all away for 50 years, to anyone with a patch of dirt and the will to plant it, so that whatever came, drought or dam or the price of things, no household in that country would ever again stand at a fence and watch the last of its food go into the ground dead. Anyone can hoard water, he had written near the end in the shaky hand of a very old man. It takes no more than a lock and a lawyer. He had underlined the next part twice. But you cannot hoard a thing that is alive. A living thing you can only keep by giving it away, because the only way seed stays alive is in the ground, in other people's hands, in more places than any one man's fence can hold. That, he wrote, is the only kind of wealth the desert cannot take back. Tomas closed the ledger. Above him, through the low old glass, the sun was coming up hard and white on a county that did not yet know what it had lost, and did not yet know that it had not quite lost it. And somewhere in Rio Seco a lawyer was already opening a letter, because the trackhoe was not the only thing coming. On Tuesday night Tomas told Elena everything. He sat her down at the little table with the copy of the recorded deed and the stamp from Dolores Aragon's office, and he told her about the deed and the well and the glass house under the ground, and the tins and the ledgers, and the boy who watched his father plow the corn under. Elena did not say very much. She was a woman who had cleaned other people's rooms for 11 years, and had learned to keep her hopes small so they would not break. And Tomas could see her holding this one at arm's length, afraid of it. But at the end she reached across the table and put her hand flat on the deed, over their family name, and she said, "Then we do not let them put it in a hole." And that was decided. Wednesday morning Tomas stood at the gate of his own land, in a clean shirt with the recorded deed in a plastic sleeve. And when the flatbed came grinding up the dirt track with the yellow trackhoe chained down on it, and Ray Buell's diesel pickup behind it, Tomas did not move out of the road. Ray Buell got out mad, and then he got out confused. And Tomas handed him the deed through the window and said quietly that the county could not demolish a man's house without the man's leave, and that this was the man, and this was the deed, and it was recorded in Book 481, page 93, and Dolores Aragon at the courthouse would tell him so. Ray Buell read it twice, and got on his radio, and there was a long wait in the heat. And then the trackhoe went back down the road on its flatbed without turning a wheel. It was the first thing Tomas Reyes had ever owned in the United States, and the first morning of his life he had stood in a road and made the county turn around. And his knees were shaking under him the whole time, and he did not let it show. He thought that was the fight. It was only the start of it. The letter came to the trailer on Friday, certified, so that Elena had to sign for it in the Corolla in the motel parking lot on her lunch. It was from a law firm in Albuquerque, 3 names on the letterhead, and it took Tomas most of a night, and Miguel's help with the hard words to understand it. And when he understood it, the fear came back on him cold, the old fear, the one that said the papers are never in your favor. The letter was from a company called Caldera Basin Holdings, and Caldera Basin Holdings said the quitclaim deed to Tomas Guadalupe Reyes was void. It said Emmett Crannle had not been of sound mind, or had not owned what he gave, or both. It said that upon Emmett Crannle's death, the Crannle Nursery, and most particularly, quote, all appurtenant water rights, unquote, had reverted to his estate, and that his estate belonged to his lawful heirs, and that his lawful heirs had assigned their interest to Caldera Basin Holdings. It said Mr. Reyes should vacate. It said a great many things in a great many words, and under all of them, when Tomas finally dug down to it, was the one thing that mattered. The thing the whole letter was built to reach without ever quite saying it plainly. They knew about the water. Tomas had thought the fight was over 11 acres of scrub worth $4,000. It was not. A company like Caldera Basin Holdings did not send 3 lawyers from Albuquerque after $4,000 of scrap glass. They had come because someone had told them what Tomas had learned in 3 mornings under the ground, that the Crannle well was not dry, had never been dry, and that under it, older than the reservoir, older than the state's whole system of dams and pumps and permits, lay a senior water right from a deep aquifer, a right with a priority date from the 1880s, and that a right that old and that deep, in a county dying of thirst, was worth more than every building in Rio Seco put together. In the desert Southwest, the water is the only real wealth, and the oldest right to it is the crown. And a company that got its hands on the Crannle right could pump that ancient water and sell it to the cities. And the pecan combines while Rio Seco's shallow wells went to dust. That was the prize. The land was nothing. The glass house was nothing. The seed was worse than nothing to them. They wanted the water, and to get the water clean they had to get Tomas Reyes off the deed. And the cheapest way to move a man like Tomas Reyes was to remind him what he was, an immigrant, a laborer, a man with $300 and no lawyer, and let him understand that he could not win. The heir who had signed his interest over to Caldera Basin Holdings was a man named Dale Crannle. Tomas learned it from the papers. He was Emmett's grandnephew, the son of a nephew, and he lived in Scottsdale, Arizona. And he had, as far as anyone in Rio Seco could remember, come to the county exactly once for the reading of a will that left him nothing, and had gone away angry. He had not come to the funeral either. He had not written a letter or grafted a tree or handed a packet of seed across a fence in his life. But he was blood, and the company's lawyers had found him, and blood on a piece of paper is a key that opens a great many doors. And Dale Crannle had been happy to hand his over for a cut of the water. Tomas did not sleep that week. He read the letter until the paper went soft. He had beaten the county because the county was slow and the deed was plain, but a company with 3 lawyers was neither slow nor plain. And he knew, the way a man knows the difference between weather he can work in and weather that will kill him, that he could not fight this alone. He did not have the words. He did not have the money. He did not have the standing. What he had was 11 acres, a well the state said was dry, and a room full of things no court had ever heard of. It was Dolores Aragon again, who gave him the one name that mattered. He had gone back to the courthouse to ask her what a man was supposed to do, and she had looked at him a long moment, and then written a name and a phone number on the back of a recording slip. Harlan Doss, she said. He ran the county agricultural extension office for 38 years, before there was no county left to extend anything to. He's 79 and he's got a heart condition, and he's the meanest kind man you'll ever meet, she tapped the slip. And Tomas, Harlan Doss ate off Emmett Crannle's seed his whole life. His mother did, and his mother's mother. You go tell him what you found out there. You go tell him about the well. She looked at him over her glasses one more time. There are people in this county who have been waiting 50 years to find out whose hand it was. Harlan Doss lived in a stone house on the edge of Rio Seco with a garden out back. That was the last truly green thing in the town. And when Tomas told him, standing on the porch with his hat in his hands, what was behind the shadecloth wall at the Crannle place, the old man sat down slowly in a metal chair and did not speak for a while. Then he said, "The apricots. What did the apricot tag say?" And Tomas said, "San Isidro." And Harlan Doss, 79 years old, put his hand over his mouth like a man hearing that someone long thought dead had been found alive, because that Tomas came to understand was exactly what he was hearing. "My mother had a San Isidro apricot," Harlan Doss said, "in the yard on 3rd Street. It came from Emmett, though she never knew where he got it. Nobody ever knew where Emmett got anything. He'd just show up in that old truck with a start wrapped in a wet feed sack and say, 'Here, put this in the ground,' and drive off before you could offer him $1 or a cup of coffee. The tree froze out in the '89 cold snap. I've hunted that apricot for 30 years. Every nursery, every catalog, every old-timer in 4 states. Everyone told me it was gone." He looked up at Tomas. You're telling me it's been 8 feet under the ground at Crannle's the whole time, watered by a well the state paid me, personally, in 1996 to certify as abandoned. That was the thing that turned Harlan Doss from a sick old man on a porch into the ally Tomas needed. Because Harlan Doss had a grievance of his own, an old professional shame he had carried a long time. In his years running the extension office, he had been the county's man in the water adjudication. And he had signed the survey that listed the Crannle well as dry, and the Crannle right as abandoned. Because that was what Emmett Crannle had walked him out there and shown him, a capped steel pipe, with a plug in its throat and not a drop in it. Emmett had lied to him. Emmett had lied to the whole state, deliberately, patiently, for one reason, so that no one would ever put a meter and a pump on that old water and haul it away to the cities. And Harlan Doss, sitting on his porch, worked it out in front of Tomas and began slowly to laugh, a dry old man's laugh with tears in it. He used me, he said. He used me to hide it, the one honest surveyor in 3 counties, and he used my own signature to make his water disappear. And I have been ashamed of that survey for 30 years, thinking I'd missed a live well, thinking I was a fool. He wiped his eyes. I wasn't a fool, I was his fence. Harlan Doss had something better than shame, though. He had records. 38 years of an extension agent's records, boxed in his garage, county garden censuses and 4-H rolls, and the little unofficial log he had kept his whole career of who in the county was growing what, because it had been his job to know. And in those records, cross-referenced against Emmett Crannle's ledger of gifts, was a thing no lawyer in Albuquerque could wave away. The same seed, the same starts, the same named varieties, showing up in garden after garden across 3 counties, decade after decade, always for free. Always traced back to one old man in a straw hat and an old truck. It was proof, not of ownership which the recorded deed already proved. Proof of what the place was, and what it had done, and what it would go on doing if the court let it live. Between them, over the next weeks, Tomas and Harlan Doss went through the rest of the boxes from the office, and it was Harlan, who could read a legal paper the way Tomas could read a field, who found the last layer of it. In a folder marked only with a year, they found 4 documents, each one the same. Each was a water debt. In the dry years, small farms in the valley had fallen behind on their assessments to the irrigation district, the yearly charge for the ditch water that kept their orchards and their kitchen gardens alive. And when a farm cannot pay the water district, the water gets shut off. And when the water gets shut off in that country, the farm dies, and the family leaves on the road out of town. 4 families had stood at that edge over the years. The Vigils in Cañoncito, the Trujillos with their apricot orchard, the Senas, and in 1983 the Doss family garden on 3rd Street, when Harlan's own father lay dying, and the assessment went unpaid, and a notice came to shut the water off. Emmett Crannle had paid them, all 4. Quietly, through the district office, without his name ever going on anything the families would see, he had bought up their water debts and then forgiven them, marked them paid in full, and asked the district clerk to say only that a friend had taken care of it. Harlan Doss held the paper for his own family's debt in his 2 hands and read it and could not speak. He had been 25 years old that year. He had always believed, his whole life, that the water had been saved by some mercy in the district office, some clerk who looked the other way. It had been Emmett Crannle. The man had kept the Doss garden alive so that the San Ysidro apricot in the yard on 3rd Street could go on growing. The same apricot Harlan would spend 30 years believing he had lost. The same apricot that was, this whole time, alive under the ground at Crannle's. The old man had been holding the 2 ends of that thread for 50 years, and no one had ever seen the hand that held it. He didn't just feed this county, Harlan Doss said, at last, very quietly. He kept its water on. 4 times that we can prove, and God knows how many we can't. He spent everything he had. That's why the nursery looked broke. He wasn't broke, he was spent. He set the paper down as carefully as if it were one of the seed tins. And now a company that never grew a thing in its life wants to take his water and sell it to Phoenix, and the only man standing in the way is you. He looked at Tomas Reyes a long time. You know what that makes you, son? That makes you the last thing he grew. Word got out the way it does in a small county, not through any announcement, but through 100 kitchens. Dolores Aragon told her sister. Harlan Doss told the men he had coffee with. Elena, who had kept her hope at arm's length so long, told one woman at the motel. And the woman had a Bolita bean plant in a bucket on her step that had come, her grandmother always said, from the old man at the nursery. And within a month, the story of the glass house under the ground, and the well that was never dry, and the company from Albuquerque that wanted to take it, had gone out into every garden in 3 counties, into every household that had ever put one of Emmett Crannle's seeds into the dirt without knowing whose hand had grown it, which was nearly all of them. And the county that had let the old man die alone, that had called his life's work a heat trap and a liability, and tagged it for a hole in the ground, began, house by house, to understand what it had almost lost, and to get angry, and to get organized. Caldera Basin Holdings filed its suit in the district court in the county seat that August. It asked the court to void the quitclaim deed and to declare that the Crannle water right, if any survived, belonged to the estate and therefore to the company. Tomas had no money for a lawyer. What he had, it turned out, was 3 counties. A young woman named Priscilla Montano, who had grown up in Truchas eating squash from her grandmother's garden and had gone away to law school and come back to a legal aid office with 4 attorneys and no money, took the case for nothing because, she told Tomas the first day, her grandmother's squash had come from the old man at the nursery, and she had not known that until 3 weeks ago, and she intended to do something about it. Harlan Doss brought his boxes. Dolores Aragon brought the record, and the county's gardeners brought themselves. Tomas did not understand all of the law, and he did not pretend to. But Priscilla Montano explained the shape of it to him at the little table in the trailer, moving the salt and pepper shakers around to stand for the pieces until he could see it whole. The company, she said, had a problem it had made for itself. To take the water, they had to prove 2 things at once, and the 2 things ate each other. First, they had to prove the deed to Tomas was no good. But the deed was recorded, 11 years old, plain on its face, signed by a man every witness in the county would swear was sharp as a tack until the week he died, a man who had run his own affairs and driven his own truck at 93. There was no proving Emmett Crannle did not know what he was doing. His whole life was the proof that he knew exactly what he was doing, always, better than anyone. And second, she said, moving the pepper shaker, they had to prove the water right was alive and valuable, because a dead right is not worth suing over. But the state's own record said the right was abandoned, so the company was in the position of having to walk into court and argue that the very right the state had called dead in 1996 was in fact alive and senior and worth millions, that the well had never truly been abandoned at all. And the minute they prove that, Priscilla Montano said, and she smiled for the first time, they prove our case for us. Because a water right in this state stays alive one way and one way only. Continuous beneficial use. You have to actually use the water, year after year, or you lose it. If that right is alive, somebody's been using that water, continuously, for 50 years. And we can put 50 years of witnesses in that courtroom who watched it grow the greenest garden in the county, 8 feet under the ground the whole time the state thought it was dry. She set the shaker down. They can have the deed void or the water alive. They cannot have both, and they need both. The hearing took 2 days in a courtroom with a laboring air conditioner and every seat full. Tomas wore the one suit he owned, bought for a funeral he had gone to years ago, and let out at the seams by Elena the night before. Dale Crannle sat at the company's table in a suit that cost more than the Reyes family's car, and he did not look at Tomas, and he did not look at the gallery. And the gallery was full of the people his uncle had fed. The company's lawyers were good, and they were thorough, and they spent the first morning trying to make Tomas Reyes look like what they needed him to be, a laborer who had gotten his hands on an old man's signature. And then the afternoon came, and Priscilla Montano began to call the county. She called Dolores Aragon, who read the recording into the record, book 481, page 93, and testified that in 31 years she had never seen a cleaner conveyance, and that Emmett Crannle had come into her office to record it himself at 93, and had asked her, she remembered, to be sure the middle name was spelled right, Guadalupe, because the man it belonged to was proud of it. She called Harlan Doss, who came to the stand slowly, with his heart pills in his shirt pocket, and told the court that he was the surveyor who had signed the Crannle, well abandoned in 1996, and that he had been wrong, and that he had come to say so under oath before he died. He testified that the well behind the shade cloth had never been dry a day in 50 years, that he had now seen it running with his own eyes, and that the greenest, oldest, most continuously watered garden in 3 counties had been growing over it, The entire time the state believed it dead. He testified about the ledger and the gifts and the 4 water debts an old man had quietly paid to keep other families' water on. When the company's lawyer asked him, sharply, why anyone would hide a live well for 50 years, Harlan Doss looked at Dale Crandle for a long moment and then looked back and said, so that men like the ones who hired you would never find it. And I'd say he called that about right. And then Priscilla Montano called the county itself. One after another they came. An old woman who brought in a coffee can the boleta beans her mother had grown from Emmett's seed, and testified she had grown them every year of her life and eaten them in every dry year when there was little else, and that they had come always for free. A man who testified that his family's apricots, in a bad year in the 80s, had been the only fruit on their table, and that a start had appeared at their gate, wrapped in a wet feed sack with no note. A schoolteacher retired now, who had grown the Rio Seco chile with 30 years of children. One by one, 50 years of a county stood up in a courtroom and testified that they had eaten, and their children had eaten, from the hand of a man they had never been allowed to thank, and that the water the company said was dead had, the whole time, been keeping something alive. It went on until the judge, who was himself from that county, had to call a recess and was seen in the hallway with his back to the room. Caldera Basin Holdings settled before the second day was out. There was nothing else they could do. To win the water, they had needed the well proven dead. And a courtroom full of their own neighbors had just spent an afternoon proving, under oath, that it had never stopped running. They withdrew the challenge to the deed. They released their claim to the water. The court entered an order confirming Tomas Guadalupe Reyes as the owner of the 11 acres and of the Crandle water right. An old deep senior right with a priority date of 1884, confirmed alive by 50 years of continuous beneficial use, and worth, the company's own filings had sworn, a fortune. Dale Crandle left the courthouse quickly, through a side door, and Tomas Reyes, who had every reason and every right to say something to him, did not. He thought about it. He had rehearsed in the bad nights the things he might say to a man who would sell his own uncle's water to Phoenix and let a county die of thirst. But when the moment came, standing on the courthouse steps in the heat with the deed confirmed in his hand, Tomas found he did not want it. The old man in the ledger had written that you cannot hoard a thing that is alive, and Tomas understood, watching Dale Crandle's rented car turn onto the highway, that a man so poor he had nothing to give away, but his own family's water was already living in a drought no court could end. Tomas let him go. There was work to do, and it was not the work of hating anybody. The fortune sat under the ground, in the well, and Tomas Reyes never sold a drop of it. That was the part the newspaper in Albuquerque could not understand. When it sent a young man out to write the story of the immigrant laborer who had won $1 million water right and gone on living in a rented trailer. Tomas tried to explain it to him and gave up, because it was Emmett Crannle's answer, and not his, and Emmett had already written it down better than Tomas could say it. Anyone can hoard water. It takes no more than a lock and a lawyer. What Tomas did instead was the thing the old man had trusted him, alone, to do. He kept it alive by giving it away. He did not do it alone. The county that had come to the courthouse came out to the nursery. Priscilla Montano drew up the papers to make it a nonprofit, the Crandle Seed Library and Cooperative, so that no company could ever come at it again through a single man's death, and so that the water right was tied forever to the living use of the land and could never be pumped out and sold. Harlan Doss, in the last good year of his life, sat in the cool of the sunken glass house and taught a room full of teenagers and grandmothers how to save seed, how to fold the packet and date the tin and keep the small green fire banked against the winter. And Tomas Reyes, who had spent 25 years grafting other men's trees, stood in the shade with a paring knife and taught anyone who came, the way an old man in a straw hat had once taught a frightened boy of 19, splicing a bud of one tree into the living wood of another until the two grew as one. They cleared the broken glass, not to knock the greenhouses down but to raise them back up. And by the second spring, the front houses that the county had called a heat trap were full of starts again. Thousands of them, the San Isidro apricot and the Escobosa apple, and the Perdido pear and the Rio Seco chile Colorado, and the striped Milagro melon, going out by the boxful for free to any household in 3 counties with a patch of dirt and the will to plant it, exactly as they had for 50 years, only now in the daylight, and now with the name of the man who had grown them said out loud. The old woman got her milagro melon seed. She planted it, and it grew, and she wept in her own garden, and she was not the only one. Miguel, who was good with his hands, found work at last, real work, on his own family's land. He ran the little pump house and kept the cistern clean, and learned from Harlan Doss to read the county's water the way his father read its dirt. And Tomas watched his son bend over a graft in the green light, under the glass, and understood that this too the old man had grown, though he had never met the boy. Elena kept cleaning rooms at the Sunrise Motel through that first hard year, because hope is a thing you keep at arm's length until it proves it will not break. But by the second year, the cooperative could pay a small wage to the woman who kept its records and its doors. And she came home smelling of turned earth instead of bleach. The coffee can on the shelf above the stove held more than $312 now, though not by much, and not because they had sold the water. They never sold the water. They were not rich the way Caldera Basin Holdings had meant to be rich. They were rich the only way the desert allows, which is that they had something alive, and they kept it alive by putting it into other people's hands. On the anniversary of the day the county trucks had come to knock it down, Tomas Reyes drove out to the nursery before dawn, the way he still did, awake since 4, and he walked the length of the shadecloth wall, gray and stiff and exactly the color of dust. And he went in through the plain wood door and down the 6 brick steps into the cool, and the green and the sound of the water that the state had sworn was gone. He sat on the bottom step where he had once wept, and he was not weeping now. Above him the small birds came in low over the wall the way they always had, going into the only water for miles, and the light came soft through the 50-year-old glass. And the grove that a boy who watched his father plow the corn under had grown back tree by tree from the last living wood in the world, stood green and heavy over the well that had never once run dry. He had heard people in town that year try to say what Emmett Crannle had been, and mostly they got it wrong, because they wanted to make him a rich man's kind of good, a man who had given away a fortune. But Tomas had read the ledgers, and he knew it was the other thing, the harder thing, the thing the old man had underlined twice in a shaking hand. Anyone can hoard water, he had written. And Tomas thought, sitting there in the cool over the well, that if he ever had to say in one line what Emmett Crannle had done with his 94 years, it would be that, and one thing more: anyone can hoard water. He spent 50 years teaching the desert how to keep something alive. Tomas Reyes, 44 years old, who had crossed north with nothing and worked other men's ground for 25 years, and been told the old glass nursery was worthless desert, sat in the cool under the earth and listened to the water. And he meant to spend the rest of his own life doing the same, and to teach his son, and to give it all away, so that it would never, in that dry country, be gone.